Greetings, this is Angelos de Mortio with another multiplayer build guide in Dragon Age Inquisition. And now we come to the Elementalist, master of primal magic. For those of you familiar with Dragon Age Origins, this guide will build the Elementalist as a controller, which is a role devised for altering the movement of enemies, typically through inhibiting or debilitating. The Elementalist is a cocky sort of mage that brings back fond memories of Morrigan or Anders from Origins and Awakening. His childish attitude starts off as obnoxious, but quickly becomes rather endearing when hearing him proclaim, "See that? I did that!" as devastating fire rains from the sky. Now bear in mind here that this build is designed as a pure controller and as such focuses on AoE crowd control most of all. While you certainly can get kills, the primary goal should be instead to keep enemies contained and manageable for the damagers to quickly clean up. As usual, I will outline skills and theory craft, but the strategy will be more in-depth here given the complexity of using a controller. With that said, let's get started. Alright, let's start with Stone Fist. Stone Fist is a single target damage and disable skill. It launches a rock that is magically condensed into, you guessed it, a fist and launched at the enemy, doing 500% spirit weapon damage and knocking the enemy down. Not to mention, with a rather fast casting animation and an 8-second cooldown, Stone Fist can be spammed frequently and easily. Now, that may not sound like much of a controller skill, but with its upgrade, Shatterstone, Stone Fist will stagger all enemies within 4 meters of the point of impact and inflict weakened for 10 seconds. Also, Stone Fist is unique in that it is one of few skills that can multi-combo because it inflicts weakened and is an impact detonator, the detonator usually relegated to warriors. What that means is that weakened can be combined with shocked to inflict sleep. Sleep can be detonated with an impact detonator to create the rupture combo, which deals massive damage over time and ignores armor. Did I mention that all electric base staves are guaranteed to inflict shocked on the final basic attack of the animation chain? Next up is Wall of Fire. The Elementalist summons a 6-meter wide firewall that inflicts burning and panic on any whom touch it, that are not immune of course. While the enemies and allies alike can technically pass right through it, the enemies afflicted with panic most often will either stop in their tracks or turn and flee. Adding the upgrade Lasting Flames doubles the width of the wall and causes burning to last 4 seconds longer. This is hands down one of the best crowd control abilities in the game and quintessential for choke point control. As nearly all grunt enemies are vulnerable to panicked and burning, this is an excellent way to both keep the bulk of enemies at bay with panic and thin out weaker troops with burning damage. After that, we have Firestorm. This is another focus ability translated into multiplayer. And as is expected of focus abilities, it is devastating. Firestorm summons balls of fire to rain down from the sky, inflicting fire damage and knocking enemies down within a relatively large area. This lasts until 12 of these meteorites has struck the ground. Now, the damage is not that great, with each meteorite doing about 100% fire weapon damage, and there are enemies immune to the knockdown. As such, like Wall of Fire, it should be used as a means to inhibit and thin out weaker enemies so the team can focus on the stronger ones. Finally, we have Lightning Bolt. This seems like a rather simple single target damage and disable like Stone Fist. The Elementalist quickly summons a bolt of lightning down from the sky that strikes an enemy, dealing 200% electric weapon damage and paralyzing the target for 2 seconds per each enemy within a few meters, including the target himself. However, like Stone Fist, Lightning Bolt also considerably expands its utility with the upgrade Exploding Bolt. This causes the bolt to do an additional 200% bonus damage per enemy within 4 meters, and if at least 3 enemies, as far as I can tell, are nearby, the bolt will send out a shockwave that knocks down all nearby enemies except the paralyzed primary target, if he's even still alive. This is a very underused skill from builds I see and seems to be a bit misunderstood. The AoE knockdown is definitely the shining point here, but did I mention that enemies afflicted with paralyze can be detonated with impact detonators for a discharge combo? Now, there are several passives of note in this build. I'm going to list them here a little out of order to make their synergy a bit more clear. Control of the Elements is a unique passive that grants a 15% duration bonus to all status effects inflicted by the Elementalist. Weakened, Burning, Panicked, and Paralyzed are all frequently used by this build, so this passive is an easy choice. Death Siphon returns 20 mana and 10% health to the Elementalist whenever an enemy within about 10 meters of the Elementalist dies. Defiant is the Elementalist class-specific passive that grants a +5 to magic and a +4 to cunning. The cunning is particularly important with our next passive, Flashpoint. Upon landing a critical hit, the next spell or ability cast does not trigger a cooldown. Clean Burn reduces the cooldown of all abilities by a full second when you cast a spell or ability. Gathering Storm reduces the cooldown of your abilities by a half second when you cast a basic attack. Winter Stillness reduces the cooldown of your abilities and increases your mana regeneration rate if you are standing still for at least 3 seconds. And finally, we have Static Charge. This hidden gem deals about 100% electric weapon damage and inflicts paralyzed for 2 seconds on an enemy that hits you while you are in the process of casting a spell. This is especially helpful when casting those AoE spells like Wall of Fire or Firestorm that leave you completely vulnerable while you're aiming them. Now, before we get into strategy, let's cover a few topics. First, the Elementalist is the only class of which I am aware that can complete 3 separate combos, being Sleep, Discharge, and Rupture. Those are not all that straightforward, however. The Sleep combo requires you to complete the entire basic attack animation chain with an electric staff for the shocked effect, and follow that with an upgraded Stone Fist for the weakened effect. The Rupture combo requires you to complete that Sleep combo I just mentioned, then hit the now sleeping enemy with another Stone Fist for the impact detonator. In a realistic team environment, most enemies will be dead before then, but it is important to note its usefulness against the Red Templar commander, whom is vulnerable to sleep and has a very high armor rating, adding benefit to the Rupture combo ignoring armor. The Discharge combo is much easier, however, and you will find yourself detonating it frequently by accident, as this build makes it very easy to spam Stone Fist, the detonator, quite a bit, and there are 2 ways to paralyze enemies, the primer. The Discharge combo actually becomes a reliable means of damage and knockdown. The only part about the Discharge combo to note also ties into the other topic I should mention, mana management. This build has 2 skills with a 65 mana cost, 1 with a 50 mana cost, and 1 with a 35 mana cost. Overall, this curve is not ideal for a mage. Typically, you do not want more than one ability costing 65 mana. But the only reason it works is because of the passives for this build, like Death Siphon and Winter Stillness, that greatly increase your mana recuperation. Even with that, it is sadly not enough to cast Lightning Bolt and Stone Fist in quick succession to detonate discharge combos at will without a well-placed Lightning Bolt to paralyze the enemy for at least 4 to 6 seconds. There is no gear that increases your mana pool like there is for stamina, sadly, but bringing mana potions along that can temporarily increase your mana pool is an option if you find yourself out of mana frequently and are in a tough spot or two. I do not notice it being much of an issue, however, but I want to make sure to mention it. Now, with regards to strategy, the key, like any controller, is to observe enemy movement patterns and grouping in order to know how it needs to be manipulated. The method is in filtering the enemy. Knowing that only stronger enemies are immune to panicked and knockdown, with one exception, is an extremely helpful note. By casting Firestorm over a group of enemies and then Wall of Fire right in front of your tank, you ensure that only the strong enemies will make it to them, which is usually the enemies they want to pull. After the filtering stage, you want to focus on risk management for your tank for the remainder of the bout and let the damage classes clean up the knockdown and panicked enemies that were filtered out. While in most cases the tank can survive just fine, they can still be potentially overwhelmed. As such, you will want to dole out AoE staggers and knockdowns with Stone Fist and Lightning Bolt respectively, with the primary target of which being the highest DPS enemy around the tank. This also serves the additional benefit of weakening the surrounding enemies and/or paralyzing dangerous threats. The core goal of this can be summed up as the 4 Bs: blind, battered, broken, and bedlam. Battered, keep the enemies knocked down and paralyzed as often as possible. Broken, keep the enemies staggered and weakened as often as possible. Bedlam, keep the enemies burning and panicked as often as possible. Did I forget blind? Oh yeah. That's your melee teammates. They can likely see nothing between fire coming up from the ground, fire and lightning raining down from the sky, and fish-shaped boulders detonating discharges right in front of them. However, from your relatively safe distance spot, you are too busy conducting a glorious symphony of mass destruction to even notice. As I always say, however, this is not the best build for the Elementalist. There is no such thing as a best build. Have another way to build the Elementalist? Let me know in the comments below. As always, if you enjoyed the video or just have something to say, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Once again, this is Angelus de Mortiel, signing off.